Hi, everybody. Hey, it's Mr. Forrester. I'm back again. Hey, I'm going to give you kind of a short introduction to chapter 14 with this recording of the book. So give me a second here. Let me share my screen. Okay, let's see. I want to get to, oops, hold on before I share this screen here. I want to get to my ebook. I have a book. I have a copy of this one here. So let me share my screen again, just to make sure we're all seeing the same thing. All right, so chapter 14 is called, it's planning for a Linux installation. And the basics of this is, now first of all, because it's chapter 14, it's assumed you've done the first 13 chapters, but it doesn't make sense to go through all the work and learn all about Linux, only then to turn around and learn about how to prepare for a Linux installation. So that's why I'm doing it in reverse order. So chapter 14 should be planned for Linux installation. You know, what is the hardware and software components and stuff, pre-installation checklist and things like that. So, you know, you need to kind of know what's your requirements, you know, what are your system requirements and stuff, and say, hey, look, you know, are these recommended ones, or are these minimal installations or whatever? And you know, my gut instinct for most of my Linux distros and stuff is, you know, I'd like to make sure I have about 8 gigs of RAM. You know, I can do it with 4. 1, sure, it says 1, but you know, okay. Hard drive space for install, sure, I know I could do it with 3 gigs of space, but I really ought to have about, you know, 10 or 20 gigs of space and stuff on my hard drive or whatever. Certain displays, whether I need graphics and stuff, CPUs. So as you're reading through this chapter, a lot of this stuff that's talking about the arithmetic logic unit, the CPU, RAM, and ROM, a lot of these things are going to be stuff that are reminiscent that you learned about in CIT12 or 15. And so remember, this book takes the assumption that you haven't taken a prior computer class, so they need to lay the foundation for that, okay? So you're going to go learn a little bit about what is a storage devices and different types, you know, USB sticks and optical discs, hard drives, tape drives. Yeah, most of us aren't using tape drives, but bigger companies still do, okay? What are video cards and stuff, right? You know, and what are types of video cards like NVIDIA or AMD or whatever? And then really get us into the pre-installation checklist, whatever. And that is, before you install, you want to go through and it's like, hey, do I have a sufficient CPU? Do I have sufficient amount of RAM? Do I have an optical drive or whatever? Do I have the hard drive? We're going to go through, you're going to go through that kind of checklist, whatever, and then kind of operating systems, things that I might need to know and stuff. If I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to, you know, use the internet and IP addresses, you know, what are my host names and stuff? You know, maybe if it's a DNS server, what's my IP address for my DNS server or something like that. So, I mean, again, you're getting some of the basics of what it is to install. Now, Linux distributions are very, very lightweight compared to Windows, okay? And so you can get a lot of this information and stuff pretty easily, and to run it on a pretty, even an older computer, you know, will run quite well, okay? Because again, it's not a big high demand. If you're using a Windows computer, this part of the chapter is going to go through about how you can go through, look at the system's information to tell exactly how much memory you have and how much hard drive space that you have. You know, what kind of graphics did you have? Do you have any kind of partitioning or something like that, okay? So I'm just kind of running through it. You know, it even goes through at the last part of the chapter talking about how you can auto install Linux. So you could say, hey, I want to just automatically install it and kind of make a turnkey and then walk away from that and write a little kind of batch file to make that happen. But you know, the reality is the first time you do this, you shouldn't do any kind of automating and stuff. Save that for later on and stuff when you got some more experience or whatever. Okay. YAST is yet another setup tool. That's their control panel if you're actually using SUSE Linux. Okay, again, other Linux distros, you know, might call it their system information or system tool versus control panel or whatever. Control panel, remember, was a name that Microsoft gave to its software area. Okay, so anyway, so if you, like I said, when you look at this chapter and stuff, it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so it's just talking about how do you prepare to install. Now, in this textbook, technically the installation chapter is not until what? Chapter 2. Okay. You know, and so you have a lot. So here's your chapter summary. Again, that's it. Chapter 14, pretty simple. What are some basic hardware system requirements and stuff? What's any kind of software requirements and stuff, whatever. And then, you know, get ready for an installation. Okay. And so that's the overall feeling for chapter 14. At the end of chapter 14, there are some review questions, okay, that are here. Now, these review questions, there's not many of them. Look, there's a total of 17, okay? They're not homework, but it's fair game to me to also pull from these multiple choice or short answer questions on your Linux midterm or your Linux final. So you want to make sure you kind of go through them, but you don't have to do that these review questions as homework. They're just there to help you kind of get along, whatever. I'm going to tap the majority of your Linux midterm and final from the study guides that are in Canvas, but I may pull a few from here. So you want to make sure you kind of reconcile those and talk with your group about those to find those answers, okay? So hopefully this kind of helps you get a kind of an overall feel for what's inside the first chapter, or chapter 14, planning a Linux distribution, okay? So let me go ahead and stop this share, and then I'm going to stop this recording, and you guys have a great one.